Good afternoon once again. There's nothing like weather in Ohio to change from moment to moment. It reminds me all the rain. I think it was 3 years ago we were trying to put an expansion on our building, and it was like this. It rained every day. So hopefully the corn can be planted sometime in May so that we can go ahead and still have a harvest, because I looked at a map on a news article that was showing that about 2/3 of the U.S. is in some form of drought. So the fact that we have a different water management problem here in Ohio is actually a good thing. I have a book of poems that I wrote into about 30 years ago. And I'm going to read one to you that is dateline January the 8th, 1981. Depending on your age, that may seem a long time ago, or it may not seem such a long time ago. And it's entitled The Granny Up the Street. And it goes like this. I know a jolly granny in a dwelling up the street. She's everything and more that a granny ought to be. The calendar says she's old enough to join the ranks of worn, but she acts as if it lied about the day that she was born. She's still a working secretary, and she writes the area news, calling on and sending cards to some friend who's got the blues. She always finds some special things for the community to do. Just keeping up with her rate would make her average catch the flu. I tell her that at her age she should at least unwind. I tease and kid and tell her that she is on borrowed time. But she just laughs and says to me as she types another page, I think that you'd be better off if you didn't know my age. This poem captures the essence of a great woman who, along with her husband, had a profound impact on my young life. Now, Arthur and Helen Lorenz lived in a humble abode that actually was just torn down about a month ago, just up the street from the house where I grew up. But they were old and full of life. By the world standard, they were simple folks, German-speaking Americans who had lived in a one-horse town. After I wrote that this morning, I thought, well, that's not right. It was probably a 5-horse town. But you know what I'm saying. But to me, they were great. They embodied wisdom and a commitment to service. At their house, I was always welcome. Arthur was a mechanic, and Helen, well, I think the poem pretty much sums it up. She she was a scribe for the budget newspaper for many years, which some of you would know. And Arthur actually worked later in life in the building that my company now occupies as a furniture repairman. He had been an auto mechanic earlier. They were literally part of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. And the unique thing about the Lorenz family, they were from our community. I knew the dad and mom as well. They had, if I remember correctly, 7 or 8 sons. And again, if my memory serves me correct, 5 or 6 of them served in World War II simultaneously. And all of them were fortunate enough to return alive and thus cherish the simple things of life. They had served actually in the Pacific and the European theater. So when I ponder their influence on my life, I come to this conclusion. Who they were was more influential than what they said or what they did. And the reason who they were had such a profound impact on me was that there was no pretense. Because what they said and did was consistent with who they were, whether you liked it or not. Art would tell you exactly what he thought, and he would make no apologies for it. We have set aside this Sabbath to honor the seniors among us because we value who you are, and so we should. I'd like to just to set the stage here, quote a couple of scriptures that stand in stark contrast to where I think our culture is today. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 famously says, "Honor your father and mother so that you may have long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." So we see here that there is a connection between honoring father and mother, grandmother and grandfather by extension, and length of days. We see that repeated in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul, who was writing to the Ephesians. "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment was promised." Why? "That it may go well with you, and that you may have a long life in the land." 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 14 says this, "If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and commandments, just as your father David did, I will give you long life." Length of days, growing old, is a blessing. A blessing for those who have received lengths of days, and a blessing, I think, more importantly, to those who have the privilege of learning and living with and under the tutelage and mentoring of people that have had experience. I consider myself to have been very fortunate to, in some ways it was a unique setting. Of course, I suppose we all think our settings were unique. But in my particular case, the little village of New Bedford, who some of you may have been to, it was literally a town of 120 souls, and everybody knew everybody and everything about everybody. The unique thing, though, in my case was that when I was a small boy, there were only 3 Amish families in the little town. The rest of the people in the town were of the generation that I mentioned, World War I, World War II vets, all of them German-speaking, and that shaped who I am today, I think, in a very positive way because of the particular ethic and character that generation exhibited, and it was impressed upon me. So I've always, I've always treasured that because of the stories they told, from way back when. And of course, it was no different than it is today, back when I was your age. And then, of course, a story would follow on how much more difficult it was and how much better it was and all of those kinds of things. But, I would hear stories about the great-grandfather that came from Germany and, how he came over on the ship and those kinds of things. Let's go over to Leviticus chapter 19 for a moment. Leviticus chapter 19. I'm going to begin reading in verse 30 to get the context of the statement I want to read in verse 32. "You shall keep my Sabbath and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord." Back, when I'm just going to describe what the culture was like back then. I remember growing up, we had a Lutheran church, first the United Church of Christ, and then later a Mennonite church in the little town. course, we had New Bedford was also kind of rowdy. We had two bars at one point, just to kind of balance things out. But on Sunday, everything got quiet because everyone went to church and no one worked. Now, granted, it was the wrong day, but there was a respect for and a belief in the idea that one day in seven, you needed to refrain from work and keep the Sabbath. So continuing here, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Give no regard to mediums and familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Today we look to all kinds of New Age stuff, and we seek, I'm talking about we as a culture. And notice the next thing in verse 32. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. I am the Lord. Now, if you take that and you contrast it to what I'm about to read from an article that I pulled down from the internet, this particular writer who, let's see if I can see who it is. This particular quote is what caught my attention. Sadly, our American culture does not esteem the elderly. We are self-centered, utilitarian society. We are a self-centered, utilitarian society. It is a matter of dollars and cents that drives things instead of principle and value. The younger generation often views the elderly as a financial burden and, if they require our care, an interference in the pursuit of pleasure and success. That's just a fact. It is an unfortunate fact, but it is a fact that our culture does not value the wisdom, the knowledge, and faith that an older generation is expected to bear. Notice how the article continues. This was most outrageously stated a few years ago by then Colorado Governor Richard Lamb. In a discussion of spiraling health care costs, he said that terminally ill elderly people have a, quote, duty to die and get out of the way. Most would be more polite, but the underlying attitudes are there. Dr. Kevorkian is helping Governor Lamb's wish come true by assisting terminally ill in suicide. Brethren, we cannot make correct decisions absent the principles of God, and that is so adequately demonstrated. And euthanasia is already legal in some of the more progressive, quote-unquote, progressive countries in Europe. And the reason is, when you look at life absent God, it becomes a utilitarian decision. Does it make sense to incur the cost to extend life? Or, and then this is going to become a big debate because the consequence of the sexual revolution of the 60s has resulted in a lopsided demographic where you have more people living from the system in retirement because there are more older people than younger people to support them. And somewhere along the way, that's going to become a flashpoint. And as Governor Lamb said, it will become the duty of the elderly to die in order to get out of the way. Contrast that to what we just read in Leviticus chapter 19. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear your God. because it is God's prerogative when it comes to extending or taking life. And fear your God, I am the Lord. I find it interesting that this is packaged in the context of keeping the Sabbath, of not going in the direction of New Age religions, seeking mediums and those kinds of things, because somehow they're all connected, aren't they? Because when we look at life as simply from simply a utilitarian standpoint, and utilitarian ethics simply mean that you do what is best for the majority, you come to decisions like that seem outrageous to us today, but not that long ago, many of the things that we find quite ordinary today would have seemed outrageous in previous generations. So I'd like to begin the sermon today by going over to a psalm in Psalm chapter 92. And it is titled in my Bible, A Psalm for the Sabbath. And I'm going to read through the whole thing because I want us to have a context for what the psalmist suggests here about the purpose of aging. Beginning in verse 1, and again, this is a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. Beginning in verse 1, it is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness every night, on an instrument of 10 strings, on the lute and on the harp, with harmonious sound. For you, Lord, have made me glad through your work. I will triumph in the works of your hands. And when you have a culture that does not believe that they are created by a beneficent and loving God, all of this goes away. Continuing in verse 5, O Lord, how great are your works, your thoughts are very deep. A senseless man does not know, nor does a fool understand, when the wicked spring up like grass, and when the workers of iniquity flourish. It is that they may be destroyed forever. But you, Lord, are on high forevermore, and behold your enemies, O Lord, for behold your enemies shall perish, and all the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. But my horn you have exalted like a wild ox. I have been anointed with fresh oil. That's, I think, why we come to Sabbath services every week. To gain energy and strength through instruction and fellowship, to go back out in a culture that is toxic. That, like it says here, the wicked spring up like grass. But they don't recognize that in doing so, they are eventually going to get cut down. My eye also has seen my desires on my enemies. My ears hear my desire on the wicked who rise up against me. And then, beginning in verse 12, we begin to get to the point of the sermon today. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree, and he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. Verse 14, they shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Notice that the purpose, according to the psalmist who wrote a psalm for the Sabbath day, is that the righteous shall bear fruit in old age. Brethren, that's the topic that I want to explore with you this afternoon, bearing fruit in old age, specifically going from doing to being. Bearing fruit in old age, going from doing to being. Most of us have grown up and have done things. I remember sitting with Arthur and Helen Lorenz one evening, and they always had time. And Art was telling me about his younger days when he was an auto mechanic, and he worked and worked and worked and worked because, guess what? There was always one more car that needed fixed, and he was the type of guy that would not say no because, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then one evening he came home, and he brought his toolbox, and he plopped it on the porch with a great bang, to the point where Helen said, "What is going on?" And he said, "I've had it." She said, "What do you mean you've had it? He said, "I'm quitting." "What do you mean you're quitting?" He said, "I am going to come home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm going to get myself another job," which he did, where he would not have to work into the night. Now, this was an interesting dynamic for a guy like him. And from that point forward, he spent time being. And, you could talk about everything and anything with this man and woman. And like I said, because it was because of who they were more than what they did that had a huge influence on my life. And of course, there being no pretense, what they did and said was also who they were, so there was no inconsistency there. I'm going to look at 3 things. There are, I am sure, many more, but for the purposes of this sermon, I want to look at 3 fruits that we bear in our old age that have the ability to have great influence in the lives of others. The first one is wisdom. Wisdom is a fruit that we should bear into old age. And in fact, let's go over to Proverbs chapter 3, because Proverbs chapter 3 is wisdom personified. Proverbs chapter 3, we have famous quotes like verse 5, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil, and it will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones." But let's drop down to verse 13. Verse 13, and then we'll go to 15 and 16. "Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding." You cannot gain wisdom and understanding in the absence of experience. I mean, you can. We live in the information age, and Google knows everything. You just Google it, and boom, right there it is. However, access to knowledge without a context of experience that experienced and older people can bring is of very little use in many cases, or is often applied in an unwise manner. So we see here that happy is the man who finds wisdom. Dropping down in verse 15, "She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot compare with her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor." What we see here is that wisdom is an attribute of age, of the aged who depend on God. And when you grow up and you have the privilege of being called by God as those of you in this room are, the lengths of days, the experience and the time of exercising and practicing the ways of God bring an element of wisdom that will bear fruit. We see that right here in Psalms. Going over to Psalms chapter 9, it is also true that lengths of days is not necessarily a measure of wisdom. For those who ignore the principles of God, that's evident. But I don't think that is the case in this room. When you practice the principles of truth that are contained in the Bible, it creates wisdom. And over time, that is fruit that is born that allows you to be instead of to do. The doing can be done by the young and the energetic. We must never underestimate the power and influence of being here, being there for your grandchildren. And I knew that I could walk up the street, and if it was after 5 o'clock, they would be there. And I didn't need to have a reason. It was just part of the family. And, being old and German, they could badger and argue and peck and, do the things that you would expect them to do, or maybe not expect them to do, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter because it was who they were. There was stability. Somehow it felt like the world was going to be okay tomorrow, no matter what happened. It's a case of going from doing to being, and it's powerful, and it produces a fruit called wisdom. Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9. Beginning in verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and a knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by me your days will be multiplied, and the years of life will be added to you. Not by health care necessarily. Granted, medicine has done some wonderful things. I don't want to take away from that. But if you want to produce the fruit of wisdom in old age, it starts with the fear of the Lord. And that is demonstrated in how we live our lives. And to me, it is a great comfort to know that there are older and wiser people sitting in this room that have had the experience of life, that can and will say something when I start doing something that may not be wise. That's important. It is a fruit that has a tremendous impact. Let's go to Job chapter 32, which is going to take a look at a number of scriptures. Job chapter 32. Here we have Elihu weighing in and contradicting Job's friends. In verse 6 of chapter 32, so Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. It's interesting here that he said it should. The differentiator is that those who walk in the way of the Lord will become wise as they grow old. So many people in this room have been keeping the Sabbath, have been following God's law and commandments for decades. That makes you wise. Isn't it interesting how the culture is shifting? And, countries that we used to look to, and still to an extent it's true, as the great, what did Reagan call them, the great, what was that? No, the Russia and China and all of those countries, the great evil or something of that sort. They are now, in some cases, valuing things that we no longer do. I mean, China still has they rise up, they honor the elderly, and at the same time, the Western world is moving progressively into the direction where old age is simply seen as something that inhibits our prosperity culture. The reason that is we have departed from what made the Western civilization great. It is undeniable, if you study history, that Western civilization was influenced largely by the Judeo-Christian ethic. And, while you can go down through and say, okay, talk about all the things that were done wrong, the bottom line was there was a basic ethic that believed in the fact that there was a great God who was beneficent, who had laws and principles that were to be respected and obeyed. That is, sadly, largely gone. And the consequences are just beginning to happen. Here we see that Elihu recognized that the folly of his friends and what they were saying, and rebukes them actually by saying that age should speak and a multitude of years should teach wisdom. That only occurs when you have lived a life consistent with the laws of God. And I would say that there are a lot of years in this room in that respect. The fruit is evident. Let's go over to Joel chapter 1. Joel chapter 1. And I want to remind us of the value and importance of the older generation. At the same time, remind the younger people of the benefit of interfacing with and having relationships with older people. Notice in Joel chapter 1, verse 2, "Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of the fathers? Tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." The idea of transmitting information down through the generations, from father to son, from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, goes all the way back to this time. Actually, it goes all the way back. That was the intended way to transmit culture, information, and technical skill. We have attempted to replace that with educational, systematic institutions who now teach abominable things. Therefore, the church and the family within the church have a greater responsibility to bear the fruit of wisdom and pass it on to the next generation. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 just for a moment in this regard, because one of the presentations at the General Conference of Elders had to do with the Deuteronomy 6 model. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So that's the preface to it. We must practice and know all these things. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And if you go and read, the previous chapter, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it is a recounting of the 10 Commandments. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Notice that the transmission occurs naturally when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way. When I think back, it is the instruction that I overheard that had the most impact on me. When they sat Johnny down and gave him a lecture, which of course never occurred because I was, as my name suggests, a very, very well-behaved young boy. The word Johnny just kind of exhibits that kind of thing. I'm kidding, of course. But what I remember more is what I overheard being said to someone else. Somehow that had more impact because it wasn't directed directly at me, which goes back to my point, and that is going from doing to being. I remember hearing my grandfather tell someone else, and I have this picture in my mind. It was in front of his barn, and he was talking to a neighbor about collecting money from people that owe him, and it went like this. He said, if someone owes me something and they have no ability to pay, I will work with them and we'll figure out a way. But he said, if I have someone that owes me money and just doesn't want to pay, I will spend as much money to collect it as they owe me. And somehow that stuck with me. And I would have you know that's kind of my approach to dealing with such things like that. That message was not intended for me. I would dare say he didn't even realize I was within earshot. But I remember it. I don't know why, it just stuck with me. Don't underestimate the impact of the wisdom that you have acquired by simply being there. I could tell you some other stories about a German-speaking town that are best not given from the pulpit. that had an impact, because that's who they were. A second fruit that we should bear in our old age is knowledge. The experience. The school of hard knocks. The understanding that you reach by having done it by yourself. And when someone old says something to you, it is worth a listen. I have an older couple that we've just gotten to know over the past 5 or 7 years. They're from Bolivar. He's 93 years old, and he's one of the few people still alive that flew in the Berlin airlift. And is that a pleasure to spend time with the two of them. Because I would have you know that up until he broke his hip at a Verizon store when he tripped over something, and then proceeded to get up and sit in a chair with a broken hip while lecturing them to not call the ambulance. It kind of gives you an idea of the type of person we're talking about. Up until then, he was doing 300 push-ups a day and running up and down stairs just to stay fit. If he says something, I listen. Because in all those years, knowledge was accumulated that is worth listening to. Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, verse 1. But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that the older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love and patience, the older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to too much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. A teaching, mentoring role that has so much importance, brethren, that without doing this, Paul wrote to Titus and said that the word of God would be blasphemed. Now, if you look at the items that are being described here that need to be transmitted, the knowledge that needs to be transmitted, it wouldn't hit or make a popularity contest in our culture. To be what? To be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands. Ouch. Okay, that's a tough one in our culture. That the word of God may not be blasphemed. But this knowledge, this knowledge is a fruit that is being born in old age. And I fear that we lose it if we do not use it. How much value does that fruit have for our current culture? I would say that in contrast to the governor of Colorado, old people have a duty to demonstrate that knowledge, not to get out of the way. Deuteronomy chapter 32 says something similar. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Speaking of Google knowing everything, Google old age in the Bible, and you will get hundreds of verses. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 5. They have corrupted themselves, they are not his children. Because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation, do you thus deal with the Lord, O foolish and unwise people? Is he not your father who bought you? Has he not made you and established you? Now verse 7. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you the knowledge, the fruit of knowledge. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, when he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the children of Israel, for the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the place of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land, and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled him, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. So important was this knowledge that absent it, they became corrupted and a perverse and crooked generation. Does that ring a bell? We are calling perversion a good thing today. And lying is acceptable negotiating tactics. You almost expect it. You lie to gain advantage. And if you can get away with it, keeping your word does not mean anything. The older generation still has that knowledge. That was just the way it was. It is a fruit that you need to continue to bear. And finally, a third one is the fruit of faith. Faith is a fruit that we should bear in old age. We go back to Titus. Go back to Titus again. Paul is instructing Titus to teach sound doctrine. He was a young man. But the older men were to be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith. They were the ones that you could count on not getting shook up because of some event or some action or some problem, shall we say, in the church. The fruit of faith of the people who have been around in the church, let's be candid now, have saved the faith of many a younger person. And they will continue to do that. That is when being is more important than doing. As often doing can do damage if it's done badly. But when you have older men and women who are confident in their faith And don't get shook up by every wind of doctrine or change of administration or the latest, dare I say it, fad in the church. It is the fruit that carries the day. Psalms chapter 37. Maybe the words of David here ring a bell on why the fruit of faith, tested by years of experience, is so important. Psalms chapter 37 talks about the heritage of the righteous and the calamity of the wicked. Do not fret, verse 1, because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he shall bring it to pass. This is David writing as an old man. And I'm just reading this context and his words, but that's not really what I wanted to get to. What I wanted to show you is the experience of life that has produced this kind of confidence and faith that we find down in verse 25. I have been young, and now I am old. You know, you have to contrast. And what has David learned? Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. David learned that. I mean, that is a statement of faith. I remember when I came into the church as a young man, and the prospects of finding a good job with my exceedingly impressive credentials did not look very good. 8th grade education, one job, working for Dad, and you get fired. That is really impressive. And people in church would say, "Oh, John, don't worry about it. God will find you a better job." I can tell you, I was out of a job. I don't know how many times I heard this. People would come to me and say, "Yeah, I got fired too, and God found me this job. It was much better." And I thought, yeah, right. That was you. This is me. But there was this sliver of hope that maybe it would happen, and you know what? It did. It did. Because there were people that were bearing the fruit of faith, that had experienced what David had seen, that could speak with confidence that my kids would not, and that was honestly my biggest fear. 3 kids that would go hungry. David had seen and experienced that and could testify at the end of his life that he had been young and now he's old. And yet he had never seen the righteous forsaken nor his descendants begging bread. That's the power of being. That's the power of having experienced faith. That's the kind of faith that you don't have to preach about. You demonstrate it. And it has huge impact. Let's go over to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5. I mean, the moral obligation of the older generation is huge, because it may be, I say it may be, the last vestige of a moral fabric that was once just the way our culture was. My generation will probably bear the responsibility of having decimated it. There is another generation that is looking for hope. If they can see it and capture it, because, I mean, there's something, in many ways, I think often grandparents have a greater influence, that's probably not the right way to state it, but grandparents have an incredible influence on grandchildren if there is an interaction, and so it should be. And I think that was designed to, in the event that you have a generation that maybe goes astray, there is the opportunity to pass that faith on, to pass the wisdom on, to pass knowledge on to the next generation. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 32 and 33. Therefore you shall be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You see, faith does that. It takes faith. What we read back in Titus, they were to be, the older men, the older men were to be sound in faith. There's a steadiness that doesn't turn to the right, and it doesn't turn to the left. Because you know what? You've been down this road. You've seen everything, or almost everything. And at some point, it just doesn't shake you up. That's sound faith. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you possess. And that product, that fruit, will bring life and hope to generations to come. Brethren, old age is something to be cherished. It's not easy to get old, but it is not without purpose. The psalmist who wrote a psalm to be read on the day we celebrate today said, as we read, that you are to be fruitful in old age. Let's go back to Psalm 92 as we conclude. Psalm 92. Verse 12, the righteous shall flourish like a palm tree, and he shall grow like a cedar. Dropping down to verse 14, they shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing. If you look at the margin, it talks about full of oil or sap and green. The oil and water are symbolic of the Holy Spirit. Old age does not mean that we stop bearing fruit. It's just a question of how. I suggest, as a young man, if I dare, to all of you that are much older. Focus on being here. Don't worry about the doing. The doing can get done. It is the being that is important for the next generation. Thank you.